All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Why Read episode number 27. And here I'm with my guests, Bryce from Shelf Centered and Nico's Book Reviews. And the funny thing about this is that I was on a stream with both of them a couple of nights ago. And we didn't know it. We didn't know we were all going to be on a stream celebrating Janie Wertz's 11th and final book in The Wars of Light and Shadow. And it was just surreal because I was actually gonna get on this stream originally, and I was gonna say, "I've been on streams with Nico before, but this is, I think, my first time ever being on a stream with Bryce." And now we get to say that we've been on a stream together, all three of us,
already.
within 1 week. So that was pretty cool. So hello, thank you so much for joining us today. Hello, Shad. Hello, Anita. And hello, hello, Lily. Yes, so we're excited to go ahead and get started here. And I am going to go ahead and start with the question. We always start the Why Read series with the same question for every episode, and that is why read? And this is another way of asking in a time where we have so many things competing for our attention, so many distractions in our lifestyles in this modern age. What inspires you to pick up a book? And this can be a different answer at different times in your life or even different seasons of the year. But we're going to go ahead and start with Bryce. Bryce, why read?
Man, what's funny is this is a topic because you bring it up and you have this great series, and I've been thinking about for ages because I've been following along. And so it's been some in the back of my mind, just thinking about. And then when you invited me, then it went blank. No, but then just this whole week I've been thinking through, going, why do I read? What the heck is the point? And I came up with a list. There's all kinds of reasons, I guess, and I have a lot of them. And so I just kept listing it out when I think about something. But I mean, you can purely go on like an educational. Sorry, where am I?
He's going to fix it now.
Matt is really.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, so you guys laughing. I was like, I better check. Matt's making fun of me. Gosh. No, but anyway, so I mean, literally just on the kind of surface level of like, education, and even down to with, a lot of time I feel like fiction is like poo-pooed on, and you read fiction, so you don't like actually read good things. But even that you can learn, and you can have education in vocabulary. I mean, I learned what I thought for sure sapper was a made-up word in the Malazone world. And then I look it up and I was like, oh, that's just an actual engineer in the military. And I like, it's a real word. So now I don't trust anything.
That's so relatable as a fantasy reader. So relatable, right?
I was like, oh, that's not just all made up. Okay. All right. Okay. I got to keep up with this. But that, I mean, and then learning, I mean, just empathy and just, I mean, but those are the like good reasons, but not necessarily like, but why do I read? Okay. Come on. Get down to it. I mean, really, I mean, maybe it just comes down to the book's always better than the movie. There's something about being able to be immersed, and literally, like, I struggle if somebody's trying to kind of talk to me or anything. I'm sure most people do when you're trying to read and you now have read the same sentence 1,000 times and you're just like, I'm going to go crazy if I have to read the sentence again. And so, but when you like literally are able to just kind of let yourself get into that and just sink in, and that just feeling when you've sunk right in and you are part of now this world, whether it is in our present day, right, whatever, or in a fantasy world, you're in a different world. You're in the world of these characters, and that you just, it brings you into this whole different place, and you live then, like George R. R. Martin says, 1,000 different lives, and if you don't read, you only live one. And so you really like, and it's just fun to do that. And that's what helps, I think, with that empathy, is because you've lived those so many different lives, and I just going through this going, I mean, basically that's it, because I'm always chasing that feeling. And it was really the Lord of the Rings that like gave me that feeling the best, where I was like, ooh, I need to chase this. Like, I love this feeling, and I need to just be a part of just something, and something epic, right? And it's hard too in our day and age where you know, for the most part, I mean, look at us. We've got it pretty good. Not everybody, but you know, I definitely have a lot of privileges in my life, and just this kind of, I don't know. There's just, there's a lot of like, I don't know, things we can do to make the world a better place, but it's not in the same way that like Frodo and the Fellowship had to, right? In
Yeah.
like directly. So I just I love being able to do that. And again, you when it comes down to it, if you haven't like what is it? What's the word? There's a quote that I'm gonna slaughter, but essentially when the time for action is here, then the time for preparation is past, or something like that, right? So if you haven't thought through your morals, right? So this like reading makes me think through my morality, because you're faced, especially I think fantasy does this in such a good way of making you really have to like maybe on an exponential level think through what a moral position is in this crazy way, you know, like what is the moral position? It makes you constantly have to think and question. And so when your morals are kind of challenged out in the world, you cannot be prepared for that and to act or to like, I don't know, to step up or whatever you need to do unless you've thought about it, unless you've prepared yourself. Otherwise you kind of like fight, flight, freeze kind of a reaction in your body. So anyway, that's a whole lot that I've thought about. So all
That's a
of those
wonderful
things.
answer. And there's no wrong answer. Everyone always feels like I'm quizzing them with this question, but there's really no wrong answer to that. And that's a beautiful answer. I love what you were talking about when it comes to immersion and the experience, because we've all probably had it as readers where we're reading a sentence over and over, as you said, and having trouble finding that gateway, getting into that world, whether it's fantasy or not. And then when you're in, it's like real life magic, right?
Yeah.
But what's powerful also based on what you said is that I know that when I first fell in love with reading, it wasn't necessarily fantasy I fell in love with, but it did feel that immersive. It did feel like I am not here. I am in this story. I am with these characters. Joanna has disappeared. This is not an object called a book. These are not words on a page. I am in story. And then when I got out, I would have to reorient myself
Oh
again.
yeah.
But when I discovered fantasy, which I discovered it through The Hobbit and then Lord of the Rings, I'll never forget that kind of transportation. It takes the transportation of reading to a whole other level. There's a whole other level of when you're in a secondary world. It's indescribable. And I also love what you were saying too about moral quandaries, because I think that fantasy does that also very well. I mean, all types of literature explores that, but that's also something really special when it comes to the reading experience, as well as learning vocabulary, as you mentioned too. I know that we're going to probably talk about Wars of Light and Shadow in this stream, and my goodness, I have learned some words reading Wars of Light and Shadow.
Yeah.
So yes, but Nico, you want to add to this? Why do you read? What's your answer to the question today?
Yeah, and it also you brought up a ton of great stuff, Bryce, and the vocabulary thing also just makes me laugh because I can't tell you how many times in my life that like my wife or somebody else would just be like, what word even is that? Why do you know? I'm just like, I read a lot, you know, I just find a lot of weird words and you don't even think about it sometimes. But
Mhm.
um, I feel like my answer has some multi facets as well and has changed a little bit over time, but when I was really young and first got into reading, I think a lot of it was just discovery, and it was exciting to me as a kid. All these things out here. It started with I read like the heck out of those Magic Treehouse books when I was really little, and like just would go through those, and then I should have grabbed the first fantasy I ever read, which took me forever to revisit, was the Prydain Chronicles by Lloyd Alexander.
I just read the first two
And
of those.
Oh, it's held up surprisingly well considering this is from the 60s. I hope he found that as well. There are
I did.
some
No, I
things.
did. I picked those up. I talked about those recently because I picked those up thanks to Bridger, who I had on Why Read earlier this year. He was my first guest in 2024. The Library Ladder is the name of the channel. And he did
Yes.
a wonderful middle grade fantasy recommendations video last year. I think it was last year or 2 years ago. And he could not say enough good things about the Prydain Chronicles. He read them when he was young, reread them as an adult. Also, like you, thought that they held up really well. So I picked up,
Yeah.
actually found the book of three in a used bookstore, but I didn't have the first book. Sorry, not the book of three. I had the Black Cauldron, book two. And so
Mm.
I needed to get the first book. So I did pick up the audiobook, which actually has both books combined into one. And they hold up really well, especially if you want a really charming, Welsh inspired fantasy story. Yes. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
interrupted.
Oh no. I'm so that I like the fact that you are excited about it too is just great because it doesn't get talked about enough. And it was one of those things that I read. Actually, I started with The High King, which is I think the last book, um, because I didn't know any better. That's what was at the library at my school. They had it, and it was that thing that was in the back of my head for so many years, and then I tracked down this copy when I was in probably I don't know my early 20s, and I tracked it down and just read it and was like, oh my gosh, so much of it kind of came back as well, and so it was kind of the first thing, and it was really special revisiting. That was some of the first things I actually did when I started doing booktube, is I talked about these a little bit, but so that was when I was younger, it was just discovery. It was just finding these new things, and it was great. And then I ended up kind of just trying to read whatever I found for fantasy. And I would at our local public library where we lived. They didn't have a ton of selection, so I read like Dragonlance, I read whatever. But then somebody pointed out that the Wheel of Time existed, and I was probably a bit young for it because I was 11 when I started reading the Wheel of Time, but I never looked back. And I just would I read the series. My library had books one and three, so I would interlibrary loan each book and then return it, get the next one interlibrary loan on repeat. And I read the series so many times, just absolutely loved it. And that was the first time that for me I was really in somewhere where I'm like, fantasy is this whole different world, and I was able to just jump in, and that's really where my love of world building and exploring new worlds really came from. Oh, you sure did. I'm sure you'll hear it again too. It's as I say, it's up there. You can't probably fully see it,
Now you
but
don't have to use the interlibrary loan anymore.
yes, no, I definitely don't. But and it's that's where like Wheel of Time I've read so many times, and it's a series that I will always absolutely love. But that's really what just kind of showed me that I could really get into a world like that. And then I definitely, as a teen, I feel like escapism is definitely a factor as well, and a big reason that I read a lot then is just I loved just being able to just jump into this other world and not be on my own. But then um, especially as I've gotten older, and especially since like being a part of the booktube community, a big part of it is just looking for really those special series and the series that make me think that I can really dig into. And I still obviously I find reading entertaining, but kind of like Bryce, with what you said with the book always being better than the movie. It's books are such a special medium because there are just things that you can't do in any other medium. There That's where it's like, people usually are like, oh, it'd be so cool to see this made into a TV show and movie. And in some ways it can be, but at the same time, there's so much more. And especially a lot of the series that I've ended up enjoying so much are the kind of things where the internal struggles and the emotions and the things that are going on, all of these things that you're not really going to be able to convey in a visual media, is just something that you can get. And that's things like reading Robin Hobb, which I only read since starting booktube, and the Wars of Light and Shadow, of course, too, which like I like in some ways I would love to see that adapted, but in other ways it's just like you can't do that in visual media. You just can't. And so it's some things like that too.
Or it
And
would only be done poorly, and you'd be like,
I
please
know.
don't.
Well, after Wheel of Time, I don't get excited about adaptations anymore. So,
Oh, I see. Yeah.
but it wasn't for me. But yeah, it's just there's so much you can do, and it's something too. Even when I was I never fully stopped reading, but I definitely like in my early adult years I read a lot less, and I was usually like one series at a time. And so I've loved getting back into reading more, but it was still, even then I'm like, what's the big series? What's the next thing I should read? And that's where after Wheel of Time I'm just like I've read this so many times and I love it, but also like what else should I read? And so that's when I found things like Malazan, and that was a big one. Gentlemen Bastards. I don't like A Song of Ice and Fire. I'll do the hot take, but
That is
I
a
know,
really hot
Bryce.
take.
I know.
I know.
But
Bryce
yeah, so
and
this is like exploring. I know you like it too.
But
yeah.
I do want to point out we do have a interest in some interest in Prydain.
Yes.
I know Philip
It is a
Reese
kid's series, but it
pronounces
is.
it differently. He pronounced it, I can't remember how Philip pronounced it with the Welsh pronunciation, but I did have a pronunciation guide in the book I had that went by Prydain. So,
Prydain.
but yeah, I thought they were charming. I mean, charming for middle grade. Keep in mind, it's middle grade, heavy messaging. So I always try to keep that.
This copy actually at the beginning of each book is just very opaque with the messaging, and it's like, this is what the author, like, this is what I'm going for here. These are kind of the lessons this one is supposed to teach. So it's like, I like, it's definitely very obviously there, and it's kind of that thing where you're supposed to find a message. But it's also like, I don't feel like it's trying to like shove it at you. It's just like, in this one, the young person's growing up a little bit and they're having to learn this lesson and these things. And so it's.
Yeah, the main character, it is kind of like the farm boy type of character, I would say, archetype, but he's an assistant pig keeper. And they keep reminding you this in the books. They're like, Taran, the assistant. He's not just a pig keeper, he's an assistant.
Is he assistant to the pig keeper?
That's what he's called. And the pig is very special. The pig is an oracular pig. So he has psychic abilities, and Taran has to make sure he takes care of the pig.
Oh man, I was looking around. I was like, I think I have the first book somewhere. I was just
like
looking at any like 1970s book or whatever it came out.
I was really impressed with them in the sense, because like even though it's written for middle grade, like I said, so it's written in a very easy to read style. At the same time, I thought the prose was still very good for fantasy prose. I still felt like it immersed you in the world to give you a sense of the seasons and the atmosphere. I thought it had fun magic. It was cute. It was really sweet. But also about Wheel of Time, Anita was asking her favorite character.
In Wheel of Time, I'm definitely Team Matt for sure, because of the later books. That's for people who start the early books. They're like, why do people like this guy? Like,
I thought the same thing. I was like, why is Matt everybody's favorite character? And then you get later and you're like, I see why Matt's everyone's favorite character.
Matt and Knife of Dreams is just like top tier.
So good.
Yeah. So Derry said that she never got into Wheel of Time when it came out. By then, she discovered Anne McCaffrey and Mercedes Lackey, Melanie Ron, and Wheel of Time looked way too aimed at blokes. That's interesting. That's interesting, Derry. It just, I think it's interesting too, like the female authors of that time, like Anne McCaffrey and Mercedes Lackey. I know Derry and I have both made videos talking about Mercedes Lackey. I haven't read any Anne McCaffrey, and that's somebody who's been on my list for a long time. I think I read one book that was I'm trying to think of who Melanie Ron was, because I always missed it.
Dragon Prince.
Dragon Prince.
They're so good.
Is that book Dragon Lance?
So I was like, it's too high for me to reach. Yes. Dragon Prince with those great whaling covers.
Let me see really quickly.
That's why I own them.
They're so good.
Because there's I think she wrote, I want to see, I'm just checking, doing a Google search. I'm pretty sure she was yes, she was. So I did read one thing by Melanie Ron. I read a book called The Golden Key. And
that's what I'm looking for.
Did you read that? It's with Melanie Ron and with Robertson and Kate Elliott. Yeah. I read.
There's one that everybody's mad about. This
you don't know it?
No, I can't find it. I know I have the Golden Key.
I have that one too.
Do you really? Oh, it's so wild.
She never finished this series, so that's why I've waited on this one.
So what I love about The Golden Key is it's written by those 3 female authors who I think were a lot more well-known back in the 90s or the 80s, I'm not sure. And the story is like one big epic story that feels like it could be in an alternate Italy or Spain. I can't quite figure it out. It has art magic in it. Oh, you have it. There it is.
I think it's huge.
And it has it felt very Italian inspired or Spanish inspired. I couldn't decide which one, but it
I think
really
it's a
had
little bit of both.
and it's multi-generational. So it follows 3 female characters over time, and I felt like maybe each author had a part to play in the development of each storyline for each of the 3 female characters, and it was a lot of fun. I had a good time with that book. It took me forever
Oh
to read,
gosh,
but I enjoyed it.
look at that!
Oh,
Look at
that's
that
cool.
author picture.
Oh, nice.
That is a very very dated author picture.
Wow.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
that's
I'm
a
so excited to
throwback
read
book.
this one. But
Yeah, I had a
I
friend
love.
who was a big fan. She gave me the book, and so I had to read it. I don't own the book anymore, unfortunately, but that's a nice edition, by the way.
I know.
I
It's got
had a mass
I've got a
market
paperback.
paperback. Well, I had that for so long, and I'm like, I don't want to read this book in mass market paperback. It's too long. I really don't want to. And then somebody found that at a local bookstore of theirs and shipped it to me
Wow.
because I'm like, yes, I need that in hardcover. So I'm very excited because I love Kate Elliott, and I need to read more Ron and Roberson and Blackie. I've read almost everything Anne McCaffrey's ever written because my library had all of it, and I liked it, but it's also wasn't necessarily for me either. But
See,
Yeah.
I couldn't get into Dragonflight. I like finished it and was like, I don't know. I've heard I need to. I think it was what's his face, Treebeard. He said you got to keep going, and so that's where I've told enough people you got to keep going with enough series that I owe him. I owe Anne McCaffrey that much at least.
You have to be a
Very fair.
marathoner when it comes to these things. It's all about the long run. It's all about keep going. Yeah.
She's
So how
got
did
some questionable stuff in some of her books as well, but that's where like I've been afraid to revisit because I feel like I might I might be a little harsher in critique than I was when I read
Yeah.
a lot of her stuff.
Well, that's something, by the way, that I really appreciate about both your channels because I know that both of you read. I mean, you read both of you read modern fantasy as well, but both of you I know as reading a lot of backlisted fantasy, but you've not been afraid to pick up books by female authors, including, of course, Hobb is the famous one, but also Jenny Wirtz. And
Yeah.
so I just wonder about your perspectives about that as being male fantasy readers and picking up books by female authors. Thoughts on that, Bryce?
I remember Mark Lawrence doing a thing and he did like a test and he like tested and nobody knew who had written these things and they tried to guess like was it male or female and like nobody could figure it out, right? Like it was like I don't know if the sample size was big enough, all that stuff, right? But I mean it's just the same. It's like, is it awesome? And they're like that, that like my only criteria is like, is it well done? And it's like Janie Wirtz, one of my favorite all-time authors. I have her on the top of all of my top lists. Like Robin Hobb too is like, especially after Live Ship, I'm still a little, I still need to read Tawny Man and catch up. But and I've heard exactly so I'm like, and I loved Live Ship. So anyway, so like Ron or whatever, Ron was like kind of like my I mean, part of it might just be like Ron was, I'd read Lord of the Rings. I remember being like, oh, I got to chase this. But then like life happened and I didn't like, I kind of picked up things. I was kind of like a reader, but then it was in college that my friend was like, you got to read this and handed me Dragon Prince. And I remember just like blazing through it in college. And then I never looked back from there. So that was like, I have like multiple stops where I like, or starts, I guess. And like, so Melanie Ron was like my like start. And I don't know if like it comes from, I don't know. I like to think I drive my wife nuts because I am so egalitarian, I guess. Because I grew up with a single mom. Like she did everything. Like I haven't known that women can't do anything, right? Like I don't know, because I get this like kind of sense out in the world where you're like, why would you think that a woman couldn't do this thing? Like it doesn't make it like doesn't even like compute. But there are people like that, and it's insane.
No, there
like,
are.
It literally does not compute to me, and I know, and that's because you like talk to women, and you're like, oh yeah, well I had to deal with this guy, and that, and they like because it's like almost daily, and you're like, I don't have to deal with that. And so anyway, yeah, it's just like, so I mean, hats off to my my mom, and I just. I don't know how, like, especially now having kids and going, how did you do this? And so just, I don't know if like like I sometimes think like some of my perspective does come from just knowing that like she just did it. Like you just do it. And there isn't any like, I don't know. There just hasn't ever been a difference to me, I guess, if that makes sense. Like they're just like, I've never seen it. Although I've had to like almost like read and get into the world to figure out, oh, people have to deal with like crappier stuff than I do. That sucks. And they have to do that on way more consistent basis than they should. And there are those people out there. And so I just, again, I live in my little bubble, I guess. And that's, you know.
Well, I'm so grateful that you have that mindset about things, because I'll go ahead and say that I remember at one point talking to a friend. This was a long time ago. This was a long, long, long time ago when I was much, much younger. I think I was a teenager at the time. I had a guy friend who was older than me, who was much more well-bred in fantasy than I was. And he just straight up told me back then, and I don't know, but back then he said that female fantasy writers, that he's like, they don't write as, he said they don't write the same as male writers, and that they're not as good. He just straight up said that. He's like, female writers aren't as good. They write differently, and they're not as good.
You haven't read enough.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, and at that time, I didn't feel like I could really argue with him, because
Right.
I wasn't as well read in fantasy as he was. But that is a perception, I think, that people don't realize is out there, you know? So what about you, Nico? I mean, has that ever stopped you, or has that ever been a thought in your brain, or you just...
Well, and for me, a lot of it came from when I was a kid. I just read whatever I could get my hands on. I didn't care who it was by. I just like, it's in the fantasy section, I'm gonna read it. So a lot of my early stuff was, I read a ton of Anne McCaffrey. I read a lot of Dragonlance, which was, you know, one male, one female author there as well. But it didn't really enter the equation that much for me. And Bryce, kind of like you said too, it's just kind of like, I'm like, what looks cool? And that's how I make many of my decisions with reading. I picked up Janny Wirtz because the cover of
we were just in a stream
Michael
while you were getting
Fire.
that book. We were just in a stream 2 nights ago celebrating Janny Wirtz over on John's panel. So it is really weird that we're all together.
We were just talking about that. That's funny. We were just there.
Yeah. Cycle of Fire. Oh, was that your first words?
Yeah, this was my first word.
My favorite is when you discover she paints her own covers. You're like,
I know. Yeah.
But like, I'm in a used bookstore and I see this, I'm getting this freaking book. Like, I didn't care what it was about. I picked this up, cover 100%. And yeah.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's funny though, because I know that when I was reading, I think it was, book 1 or 2 in Wars of Light and Shadow, I've shown my mother a couple of passages. She doesn't really necessarily read a lot of fantasy. She doesn't really care for the genre, or hasn't gotten into it as much, but she loves good literature. She loves good prose, and she got a degree in English literature. She was an English teacher for a while there. And when I read her part of Janny's book, or when maybe I lent her my Kindle to have her read a passage, immediately she fell in love with Janny's writing. Immediately she said, wow, there is such a rhythm to the way this person writes. In fact, she thought it was a male writer. She said, I love his rhythm and the imagery. And she just said, this person paints with words. Like she right away got that Janny was an artist without knowing Janny was an artist.
And you're like, how does she do this for that many pages? Like that many, like strung in a row.
Yeah. Yeah.
But speaking 100%. Of education like that, I don't want to get into spoilers, but Janny was one where I kind of was like, wait, what does make a good like hero of your story is when your hero actually cares even about the bad guys, like the guys that are against him. What? Is that even allowed? Because you go with like Lord of the Rings, you're like, well, the bad guys are anyone that turns your sword blue. And like, easy peasy, we got this, black and white. And for that was like, it opened my eyes of like, what is a good superhero? I'm using what was in the chat, hero to your story, protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. And that's where, yeah. And obviously with Janny being just such an amazing author and that I've gotten into, but I just like, with reading and with female authors, which I was in a group chat and people were joking that apparently I'm the feminist icon, because even though 2/3 of the people in the chat were women that I've read, and a lot of my favorites are female authors. So it was like they were just joking about how funny it is that they're like, yeah, a lot of our favorites are male authors, and a lot of my favorites just happen to be female authors. And it's not like I'm like, I don't even actively, I've never been somebody like, I specifically want to read this because it's a female author. I'm just like, this looks
Right.
great. I want to pick
You
it
and
up.
me.
I want to read it. And, I picked up Crown of Stars because I'm like, although I find the covers questionable, I'm like, what is this? This looks so interesting.
They kind of look cool on the spines. I like that.
Yeah. And they're interesting. With the covers, but I really enjoy it. And then like Robin Hobb, I just heard a lot about this series in general, and I'm like this looks good. I want to start this, and I feel like too the only thing that for me I feel like has probably, at least in the past, prevented me from reading even more female authors is because of the fact that, especially in 90s fantasy, which is like my niche, so much of it, if it's a female author, it gets called romance, and even if it's not, and it's something that I've had specific books like I even with Dragon Prince we talked about. People are like, oh, it's pretty romancy, and then I've had other people be like, no, it's
I
really
mean, the
not.
cover kind of makes it look that way, but
Maybe
that's
it's a
it.
cover
They
thing.
do.
It's just the
Yeah.
cover, I think.
If
Good.
the covers for this series on audiobook look like they're like smut romance
I
covers.
wonder why
What
the
they-
publishers
I've seen
would do that.
I don't know, and it's like that. It's not.
I mean,
and so
romance sells, right? Like
It
feel
does.
like it
guess.
probably
No, it
sells
does.
better.
It
Like
is,
it's
but-
as a publisher, you're like, well, if I
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
I have to
so
say
I feel
though,
like
like
you get that.
yeah, that's a really interesting point. Now, there is a lot of romance in the Mercedes Lackey I read, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily about romance. So I don't know. I don't know what that says though. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I feel like if you're a female author, the marketing
I had
usually
some
is
Mercedes
focused on-
Lackey.
I
Ah,
still need to read some.
Me too. I was
Um,
like, this is actually, I just was like, somebody said it was good.
yeah.
I
I know that
have some
Jerry
of her
did a
stuff. She's written
fantastic
so
video
much.
about Mercedes Lackey recently. I've only read the Arrows trilogy. I have a bind up here on my shelf, but I really enjoyed her writing. It reads a little bit. I think it reads a little bit younger, but at the same time, I think it's very whimsical. It had some really good themes, even though they were a little, like I said, it might read a little younger in the sense that the themes might be a little bit more transparent, maybe a little less subtle, but I still enjoyed it. And I thought the representation was excellent for a book that was written in the 90s or 80s,
Wow.
even. It was, I thought, ahead of its time. So,
Well, and that's kind of the beauty of, I think, why, I mean, I love 90s fantasy too. And I think somebody had mentioned, was it you, Nico, that was like 90s was like key epic fantasy?
Yes.
Was that you?
Oh, it's just
The
peak,
other day, you were
peak
peak.
epic fantasy. Absolutely.
Because I think, I don't know, I agree. Like, what the beauty of fantasy is, like, I mean, you could still read Lord of the Rings. Like, it's still just like, it all can be just as good today. It's maybe not told as like fast paced, and I feel like that's kind of a modern sensibility, is like, oh, you got to be blow the wind blowing on your face by how fast everything is going. But that's the beauty of fantasy, I think, too, is just that you can, like, at any point, it's still it doesn't get dated really. Like some of the I don't know, some of the notions maybe get dated, yes, but
yes, there are
the rest
certain
of it.
little quirks in writing that we can
Yeah.
definitely see as being dated, but at the same time, I think you have a solid point, Bryce, because obviously, if you're going to write contemporary fiction, then you're probably going to be writing about obviously our modern time, right? Maybe you're going to be writing about AI technology or something, or whatever. You're going to be talking about Discord or Twitter, whatever it's called, or actually it's now X, right? And then maybe 10 years from now, none of those platforms get used anymore.
Right.
Now there are totally different ones, and it's very dated. It's not going to be as relatable for people 10 years from now. Whereas if you're writing a coming of age story that's fantasy and that's written in this sort of timeless way, that might resonate for people decades from now just as much as it does now. So what people were writing about in the 90s, yeah, there might be little quirks that maybe didn't age well in the way that the authors were interpreting things, but there are still certain aspects of story that are resonating with readers now as much as they did to readers back then.
It's
Great
funny you
point.
say that because I just read the first Sandman Slim book, and the guy coming just at the very beginning, the main protagonist comes back from being gone for a lot of years, and he's getting introduced, like reintroduced to technology, and they're like, "Look at this BlackBerry." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Okay, it was a little
Yeah.
dated there, but I won't
Isn't
hold it
that
against
weird?
it."
Or like, look at my beeper. Yeah, exactly. That
Yeah.
probably is a thing. I'm gonna go ahead and read a couple of comments here. In the 90s, I was reading a ton of Dean Koontz and Stephen King. I like fantasy, but definitely not my preferred genre. Yeah, I think my dad read a lot of that author as well, well, and Stephen King as well too. So those were also popular in the 90s as well. And then Evie is asking here, question, why do you think overt theming is considered aimed for younger readers? Why can't there be there can be non-subtle theming for adult reading as well. I didn't mean to suggest that. I think I'm just I I don't know. I guess sometimes there is I think that when it comes to books that are geared towards younger readers, there does need to, in some way, in some instances, I think that theming can be a little bit more overt and virtue signaling might need to be a little more overt. Whereas with older audiences, that might not be as necessary. Um, that's just my hot take. I don't know. But I do read, I mean, I have read books with overt theming in adult literature, and I'm not against that, by the way. I think that actually theming can be done well, even if it's overt. It just depends on what the author is going for, the
Yeah.
type of story. But I do think it's a little more often that we see overt theming for young audiences. And by the way, Evie, you're the one who got me to think of that because I saw you comment on Literature Science Alliance's video so many years ago, and she was talking about young YA versus adult literature. And I saw Evie's comment on that video talk about how themes for young adults are usually a little more overt or on the nose. And that was actually the first time I got to thinking about it. So it's funny you're asking that question.
Yeah.
Did
But
you
I think
see? Was
that
it Bookborn? Bookborn had a video about like that. Anyway, sorry to
Yeah, and
interrupt, Nico.
actually, I had a discussion with Bookborn and Murphy Napier about this topic as well. And we were saying that I think the three of us on a whole, depending on the story, I mean, I think we tend to prefer more often than not less overt messaging, like more trust in the reader to grapple with things. I think when it comes to a
That's
theme,
why I'm a
my
Malzahn fan.
yeah. Well, see, what I love about Malazan is
Or Malazan, sorry.
I love it when the author, like Steven Erikson, I love it when he doesn't make it. Sometimes I couldn't figure out what he actually thought, like where he actually landed about a specific theme or topic. He was giving you one angle and then giving you the other angle, and kind of making you see that there were multiple sides to something. So like an example would be, let's say the theme is just be yourself. And some people might think, oh, if I'm just myself, people will love me and I'll be happy. But what happens when they don't? What happens if being yourself gets you ostracized? What happens if being yourself gets you killed? You know, or it's a safe, or it puts other people in danger. So
Or
I
is
think a
working
good
on
theme,
yourself, just being yourself, or is it, and is it good for you, or is it not?
yeah, I mean, exactly. What if just being yourself means, that you're going to be harmful to other people? And so I think a good theme is one that not just brings up one side of things; it brings up all types of different challenging questions to a central issue. And I think it's more brilliant
yeah.
to me, I prefer it. Maybe I'll say my preference is, I think the way Erickson does it in the way that I prefer, in the sense that he'll give you a theme and he won't just give you one positive, solid, true way of looking at that theme. He gives you the opposing view and makes you grapple with it. And I guess that's how I prefer to be challenged. I think one of you was talking about liking to be challenged when you read a book, or those moral, I think Bryce, you were talking about that, those
Probably,
moral
yeah.
quandaries.
Yeah.
And so that's just my preference. I just like to be challenged and to think, to get my brain thinking in that way. But there's
Well,
nothing wrong with it being a little more overt and explaining things a little bit more
in
clear for the audience.
in law school, they have to like almost get your mind out of, like, I'm a lawyer, right? And in law school, they have to get your mind off of here's the correct answer, and it's like
Ah,
they're like, that's not what we're looking for. And you have to like get off of, I very much was math oriented and like, here's your right answer. It's great. There's the number. But in law school, they're like, no, you argue this side, then you argue this side, right?
Yeah.
What would they want? What would they want? You have to be a zealous advocate. Like that's your job here. And so that's exactly, I don't know, maybe why I've drawn to Erickson as well as just the law in general. Cause it's like, yeah, I want to see both. I want to, even just politically, I think you don't know your side unless you know the other side backward and forward. You have to know those things. And I love, again, it helps. I'm not saying you have to.
It does. I love that. I love that you come from a law background and are able to look at it from that perspective. Because I know A Critical Dragon also comes from a law background. So I think that that's really interesting.
And then I go, wait, you don't even practice. And you're like way leaps and bounds ahead of me. So you do literature.
He's really good at devil's advocate, I've noticed. He's really good about like, if you come up with an insight, he'll be like, yes, and what about this? I'm like, okay.
No, right?
Yeah.
Well,
What about you?
I mean, that goes back to, oh yeah, I was gonna say that goes back to just something that's so interesting with fantasies, because you can really explore those different angles in ways that you might not necessarily be able to do, because especially with when you're looking up things too, and like sometimes if you want to explore the side of what's it like if you're looking from the point of view of the bad guy or the person doing this thing, and like you can't always do that as much outside of fantasy, because it's just, I feel like fantasy gives you that freedom to really explore those different things and those different sides, and yeah, being having it be more complex too. I do feel like you get more so in adult fantasy where you're looking at both sides like that too, and so I definitely agree. I think it's something that allows you to get in. If we're supposed to do work metaphors, I tend to be really analytical, I guess, and part of what I do for work involves a lot of technical details. So I like to dig into those little things, and I love books that stand up to that sort of analysis. Basically, I don't want it to, if I start digging in too far, it's like, oh, it all falls apart. Like, no, I want to be able to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that Wars of Light and Shadow also does that in a really interesting way, especially showing how people might be prone to certain assumptions about the way things are, and then given other perspectives that are affecting their sense of justice or their sense of right and wrong. I think it's really interesting the way it plays off those ideas.
Well, and pulls into like where you're going. The bad guy is really bad. Like we all know that he's getting, influenced, and then you go from there, and it's like, wow, and all the moral quandaries are there.
Oh, yes. I love, actually, that's one of my favorite explorations right now is looking into agency, like how much free will a person has and how that affects how responsible they are for certain injustices. That is such a fascinating question, and it's certainly one that applies even to our daily lives, in my opinion, especially the more that we understand. I mean, obviously in fantasy, it's going to be played on with curses, with magic, but in our real world, I mean, there are actual conditions. There could be mental health afflictions or conditions that can affect maybe our neural pathways or the way that, or trauma that affects things. So I think those are all interesting to look at. And removing reality, fantasy removes the reader's unconscious biases and allows a clear understanding of things an author is exploring. Interesting. Yeah.
That's a fantastic point.
Yeah. I love fantasy. I think, is that your favorite thing? What would you all say about your favorite thing about fantasy is? If that's a loaded question, I'm sorry.
No,
I've been thinking about this lately, and I've been just realizing I have a huge list.
No, exactly. There's a huge list. It's one because you can almost get more in immersed in this like different world. I like, just because what I do is horrendous sometimes. My wife will be like, please, maybe next time, like, don't share stories about work, because there'd just be some terrible stuff that I'm dealing with, right? Like one of the things I do is like I represent kids that get taken from parents, right, in dependency and neglect cases, and it's just one of my favorite things is to be able to read a book, get out of that world so I can actually sleep at night. Just get out of this too. Like sometimes that's the only way to do it, because you're just like, oh my gosh, like what I had to deal with today. Or you just develop a sick sense of humor, and it's like there's either that or cry under your desk all day long. So there's that. There's just being able to be immersed and pulled out of that reality is great. But I love, like you said, that just constantly, and like I said from the beginning too, is just like you're I don't know, it just gives you this option, and the long price. Maybe this is the intro you were looking for.
The long price quartet, FYI.
Really has always stuck with me, because there's that. And again, I'm not trying to go into things, but there's this like crazy moment, and you're like, oh my gosh, like morally, is that even like it's like a nuclear bomb on a place. Like, is that morally okay? Like, and you just really have to like, and in like a completely different way, of course. Anyway, I'm trying not to.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting too, because it's like you were saying, sometimes fantasy serves it helps serve us in escapism, and at the same time, there are some pretty dark and brutal things that happen in fantasy series, far more brutal than I think we can even imagine in our real world. Well, I don't know if that's true, but it goes pretty far. We'll say that.
And at least when you're like, at least I know this is all made up.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Real life, there's enough terrible things out there. Like, I can't read the real true crime stuff, because you're like, oh, this actually happened.
I know.
Yeah, but then you get Gabrielle K, who bases it on real historical periods.
Oh, I know, that's so true.
This kind of did happen.
Kind of did happen. Yeah, absolutely.
I got Lions of Al Rasana up next, so that's.
Yes.
I cannot wait to hear your thoughts, Bryce.
Reading it with Murphy in a group, and so.
Oh, yay!
So I'm like,
yes,
it's nice.
I can't wait. I did gush to her about it. And I gushed to Nico about it. I think I want to say I inspired Nico, but I don't know. Go ahead, Nico.
Oh yeah, you 100% did. I had been meaning to get to him for so long, and just talking to you about Lions, and legitimately one of my favorite all-time novels. After reading that fairly recently, and then I've been following your path, because then I did Song for Our Bone, which I also love, and I am so excited to read more of his stuff. And well, I can segue that into, he plays into what I appreciate a lot about fantasy and everything too, because my answer to what my favorite thing for so long has been new fantasy worlds, and I love world building, and it's still something that I'm focused on. But especially the more I've read, the more I've dug into, I also enjoy a just very masterfully told story. And in a way that I feel like you can only get in books, but especially with fantasy, just you get the freedom to play with the elements, and that's where like I like a story that just is told in that way, that is really well written, that challenges you with some ideas and everything too. And that's where authors like Kay and Works and others that I've read in the last several years, it's just they give me that something extra, where it's not just that, oh, this is a cool world and this is entertaining. Like there's something more, there's something deeper. And that exploration, when authors are able to do that, is fantastic. And Kay doing it in standalones is nuts, but so good.
And I'll be honest, I went probably too highbrow, because also sometimes you just need some dinosaurs with swords for arms. So
yeah, it's true. Sometimes
I do love me some dinosaurs.
Could change them all. Action, yeah. Just to respond to this really quickly, yes, I did notice that Mike's book reviews channel did get hacked, and I'm really sorry to see that. And I'm really kind of surprised YouTube hasn't fixed that.
Yeah.
All day.
I got locked out of an old Twitter account, and it was like, well, they verified with the email, and now you're just out of luck. So I'm worried. I am like, they are not helpful. You're just like, I'm the guy. I can provide like here's my ID. I can and they're just like, nope, it was verified, 2-step verification. That's what he was saying on X and Insta, is that it like they got into his email too, and then that's what they did, the 2-step verification. And I'm concerned. Luckily, I mean, he'll bounce back, but
wow.
Anyway.
Wow, that's awful.
That's terrible.
That's really terrible.
Yeah.
That's very disconcerting. And
Yeah.
but I'll go ahead
Evie's
and
right.
pivot back. I just wanted to respond to that because I know a couple of people have been asking in the chat about it, and it's terrible. But just to kind of pivot off what you were saying, Nico, like with Guy Gavriel Kay, kind of going back to that author again. One thing I was talking about, I actually talked about this a little bit with Tori, and we brought it up a little bit on our Epic Fantasy chat on her channel. Um, and uh, Basically, I found that when I was reading Tigana, even though Tigana, it's my third and least favorite Guy Gavriel Kay book I've read so far. However, there were certain elements in Tigana that made me realize this is why I love fantasy. Like certain speeches that happen in that book that have nothing to do with magic, oddly, but they were about certain ideals that I feel like are very common in fantasy: courage, honor, bravery, standing up for the truth. And I feel like those ideals are believable in a fantasy world somehow, even though Guy Gavriel Kay does write, like you said, Nico, based on historical events, and he captures a lot of historical fantasy in his books. There's something about those virtues that I feel them. I believe in them. I want to aspire towards them when I read fantasy. But if I were to read a modern day book with that, I don't know if I'd buy into it. Like there's a certain amount of buy-in I have when I read fantasy and I read
That's
characters
fair.
who are on a mission together and who are fighting together, or even in Malazan, like the bridge burners or whatever, it's bone hunters. I buy into it. But if I'm like, but for some reason, if it's a modern day setting, I don't know, it just doesn't quite work the same. And it's weird because that's something I attribute with fantasy, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with magic.
Yeah, I can absolutely get that. I feel like some of that comes just from the cynical way many of us look at the world. And fantasy gives you the freedom to kind of believe in some of those things and a little bit more. Where at least for me, because like I tend to be a bit cynical, and so if you see something like that, which is like in our real world, I'm just like, yeah, but would people really do that? But in the fantasy world, it lets me be a little less cynical. I feel like because I'm like it's fantasy, whatever we want can happen.
Well, and
So,
when someone just mentioned urban fantasy, but like when Harry Dresden mentions over and over in the early books that I don't know if you've read any Harry Dresden,
I
but
haven't
like
yet.
over and over it keeps mentioning how he's chivalrous, and you're just like, shut up. It's so annoying after a while because he just is like weird about it. Anyway, and I love that series, but like that's one of those examples I think
I
of. It was just
I
like
haven't been able to get past that stuff.
it gets like, especially when it's like 5 books in, you're like, I've read 5 books by now. We have to keep mentioning how chivalrous you are, and then I don't just his application of it was like a little weird. And anyway, don't get
Yeah.
into spoilers.
No, it's okay.
I think I quit on book 5. I just like everyone's
Oh,
like it gets better, but I'm just like not so
Yeah.
far. It doesn't. I just
uh,
oh my gosh.
I had to take long breaks in between, and then it was like,
yeah.
okay. And then now I
Maybe
like it. Yeah.
someday. I'm not quite there yet. But yeah, to answer your question, Shadia, I haven't. There's some urban fantasy I guess I've really enjoyed. And okay, I need to preface this by saying those ideals that I talked about, like I don't only love fantasy that has that kind of conversation either, or that has that kind of idealism. And Kay also shows you the dark side too. Like he's not one note in that sense either. So I don't want to paint it that way. But I mean, there are fantasy books I've enjoyed that are nothing like that, like the Dark Tower series. The Dark Tower series,
Yeah.
I would not say has the bravery, courage, honor, unless I'm forgetting something. I don't remember those kind of conversations happening in Dark Tower, but
Yeah.
it does have urban fantasy elements. It has a lot of weird, surreal stuff,
There
and I
and
loved it.
especially in what I do, there's bravery and courage in fighting an addiction. Like I think some of
Oh,
those
that's so
people
true.
are the
That's so
most
true.
brave and courageous people that I've ever met,
Oh,
that have like been
100%.
able to face an addiction that is like taken over your life and to do it for your kids or something. So I mean, like Eddie, sorry, just Dark
Yeah.
Tower, you like mention it, and now here we are. Um, but
Oh,
I love
Eddie
it.
is the
And
best. Yeah.
Detta Odetta, like again,
Mhm.
and them like kind of being able to trust another human. Like there's some of that in there still, right? Like that, like,
Yeah.
oh man, that you want to like the good, even though it's just craziness. Terrible things.
Addiction and obsession was a huge theme in the Dark Tower series, even with Roland too. It seemed like the one
Yeah.
thing all of them kind of, especially he and Eddie, grappled with for sure. But yeah, no, you're right. It definitely is there. There's courage in that. I just mean in the
Yeah.
idealistic, we're fighting a mission together. I mean,
Right.
there maybe there could be, but it's just not the series that comes to mind as far
Oh,
as bringing
absolutely.
this the kind of feeling I'm talking about, or like the Lord of the Rings kind of feeling. I think that series brings it up quite a bit too.
Well,
And
that's
like
what
I said,
George
it's
R. R.
not the
Martin is
only
like
reason.
twisting, right? Like
I'm
George R. R.
sorry?
Martin's then twisting that, right?
Oh, yes. And I love that too. I
Yeah.
love the
We
way
love it,
George R. R. Martin
Nico.
does it. Yeah. It is
I
so good.
love
How can you
what
not love A Song of Ice and
inspired it.
Fire? Go ahead. Hot take. Go ahead.
I don't like George R. R. Martin. That's why I can't stand his writing style, and it made it really difficult for me to read the books. It's also why I never watched the show, because episode 1 was too close to the books and it irritated me. So it's a style thing. He has some quirks in his writing style that just irritated me. And by Thieves for Crows, I was completely not invested in anyone because everyone dies. And I've argued with people. I get it. People are like, oh, it's realistic, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but when you kill off every character, there's no more shock value. And it's like, why should I care about any character if I know they might just die the next page? And so I will someday, if he finishes it, I will revisit it and see now. I mean, gosh, it's been many years since I read the series at this point, and so I'll see if I change my mind. But it's just, and it is. I love. I'm getting all the comments in the
I
chat.
know. I'm laughing at this right now.
I'm like trying not to interrupt.
You brought that up. I didn't bring that up. I complimented Tawny Man because I love Tawny Man. I didn't say anything about the next 7, but it's where, I mean, that tells you too, where I'm always honest, even if it's a popular thing. But if he ever finishes it, I'll revisit. But there are certain things he did. Like, that was my original hot take, and I used to rant to a friend of mine back in the day about it. He's like, you should start a YouTube channel. I'm like, nah. And then I ended up doing it years later. But
maybe you're just like emotionally like shielding yourself. Let's get into this.
I've admitted it. And no, it's just the way he writes certain things. And I've made the joke, and everybody always yells at me if I say he writes very repetitively, because I also love Robert Jordan, who's definitely guilty of it too. But there are certain things, like, if I shouldn't admit this live on the internet, but if I never heard the phrase "a mummer's farce" in my life again, I would be happy, because everything ever is a mummer's farce. Everything ever is a mummer's farce. And if you're singing a song and you're in A Song of Ice and Fire, it is the Bear and the Maiden Fair. It's always that song. Doesn't matter what continent you're on. It's always that song.
What about the Reigns of Casimir, or a few other songs?
Well, that's instrumental mostly. Probably. Yeah. I know. I'm definitely
the Bear and the Maiden Fair is such a good song.
The first time, maybe. The third time, okay. The 27th time. He also in book 3, halfway through book 3, I think it was book 3. It's been many years. I could be wrong. Halfway through book 3, he uses the word bunghole, and then he does not stop using it for the next book and a half constantly.
I don't remember him using that word.
Oh, it's because it just comes out of nowhere, and then it's constant, and like there's just little things like that he does where I'm just like, and it's just kind of like I don't tend to like a lot of sexual content in my books, so that's obviously a big part as well. The way he writes that, especially, just not for me. And so that's something that also I'm just not a huge fan of.
Well, you're not alone. I just saw a comment here.
There we go. Yeah. And that's the thing, like the story is good. I understand why people love it. It's really a style thing for me. It's just his style irritates me. And so that's kind of where, but I love, as I said, the series that inspired him to write his own 7-book trilogy, as he said. I love With Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams. So there he goes in. Same. I will read about smooth skirts and grunts and braid tugs all day, as long as I don't have to read them.
For some reason, Anita is loving everything you're saying, Nico.
Oh, she does love chaos.
You've just created a mega fan today.
Anita Ambush invited me to a live stream to talk about Realm of the Elderlings, just so people would be mad because I didn't like the book that they were talking about. And she told me about it. She did not tell any of them. I just showed up. That's why Evie always gives me crap too.
Anita loves war. That's why she's such a fan of Alan's channel. Loves war.
She's literally the Joker.
Goodness, Anita.
Oh,
Wow. Yeah, so I obviously don't share your opinions at all about Martin, but I do appreciate your feelings. I do appreciate that you're comfortable sharing that here, of course. I personally think he's an incredible writer. In fact, Brandon Sanderson even had some positive things to say about Martin's writing and editing as well. So I actually think he has an incredible gift for character voice, for dialogue, and he has a very accessible writing style, but at the same time, he's able to make it very fantasy-like. Like he's able to insert specific types of fantasy words into his writing in a very seamless way, in my opinion. And like it doesn't feel contrived at all. Plus his gift for world building, like settings. There are like 3 different castle settings in book 1 that I just adore. I adore.
Yeah.
I love Winterfell and the Vale and King's Landing and the Wall, of course. Like there are just so many settings I could just live in. So and also the characters are just phenomenal. Go ahead.
And I can acknowledge too. Same. I totally get your perspective, Nico. Like what got me though specifically was when I was like, I hated a character in book 1 and he did something unforgivable. And then book 3, I was like, is he my favorite character?
Yeah.
What? How did this happen?
It's the best.
What?
It's the best.
What?
Yeah.
I was like mind blown when I was just like, how did he do that to me? Like, I have no idea.
And it's not even,
I was like, that's unforgivable. You don't.
I don't want to give away spoilers about this. I did a video about that character and about book 3. But what's powerful to me about it is that it's not even like just a redemption. There's an element of redemption arc, but it's not just a redemption arc. It's more like a reveal arc, and it's brilliant the way he does that. Like so mind-blowing. I don't know any other author who's able to do that the way that Martin was able to do that. I don't know any other author.
That's what gets me, because I should love that series. It should be one of my favorites. I should. And I know that.
Yeah.
And that's where like I pushed myself through. I actually I was halfway through Feast of Crows and somehow my copy disappeared. I lost it. And I took that as a sign I was allowed to stop. I'm like, you know what can I do? Maybe I subconsciously, I don't know. Like I still don't know. But no, and that's where, that's why I will, if he ever does finish it, I will revisit. And see what I think, because there's a lot that I can appreciate. It would just be like I'd start. I'm like, okay, I'm really liking this. I like this, and then he would just do something that just pulled me out because it bothered me and annoyed me. But if you haven't, though, I do highly recommend reading A Memory of Sorrow and Thorn, that trilogy, because he did write it. George has said that his series was a response to that. And you'll actually see some scenes that are almost identical in those books that he did and did a different way, including the scene you guys are talking about in book 1. That comes straight from Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, although things go a little bit differently in that trilogy. And so that was where going back and reading Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, I read much later.
Oh, nice.
You got that covered too. I love it. Reading that series much later and seeing some of those things, also makes me wonder if I would appreciate it more knowing what he was doing there now too. So I'll see.
I'll do my best. I will do my best to get to Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. So we'll go ahead and pivot, because poor Nico, I've just thrown him under the bus and like
it's all good.
having him share a very unpopular fantasy opinion. So Bryce, I know you did an unpopular fantasy opinions book or video. a while back, or maybe it was like overhyped. Maybe that's what it was. Wait,
That might
books
have
we
been
thought were
it.
overhyped.
Yeah,
So
I'm like, now I gotta
want to
remember
share
this.
one of those? Any of those?
Gosh, what was it even? I think what's funny is I've changed my opinion on one of them because it was The Witcher, and I did not like it when I first read it.
Mhm.
And then I have since I reread it and actually really liked it.
I need to, I read all the Witcher books, like every single one in
Yeah.
a very short amount of time. And my enjoyment was like this. Like it just went up and then down and then up and then down. And I do wonder if it's expectation. So that's good to hear that you actually had a really good experience with it the second
Yeah,
time
there
around.
one, and I'm like, you mentioned Tad Williams because it's not actually. I think it's sci-fi, but it's his Otherland. I got two books through that, and I was just like, I liked it. It was the weirdest thing. I was just like, I liked it, and I recognize he's an amazing author, but I was like, the sheer amount of words it took to get to where we got by book two, I was just like, I can't do this for two more books. I can't mentally take this. Like I enjoyed it, and again, I was like, I recognized the like how good. So that's what I've always been like a little afraid of. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Going like I
Mm.
know he's on the slower pace, and the and again, I was like, I liked it, right? But it was just like this is as far as we got, and we're 2,000 pages into this freaking story here.
I have not read. I have heard that the first book is excellent, and then the rest are kind of. But I haven't read, so I don't know.
But it's cool.
Yeah,
It's good concepts and all this stuff again. And I just was like, I can't do this.
I am a slow burn reader. Like I love slow books. So I am
And
curious.
his story in this is amazing too. Like
Oh,
this is so good. One of the best anthologies I've ever read. Speaking of
I have
Japan.
this fancy one of his short stories that I have not actually read yet, but A Stark and Wormy Night,
oh wow.
which is just Tab Williams. I found this at a used bookstore. This is actually like a signed and numbered copy.
Oh dang.
Um,
Mm.
Nice
and
work.
so
And you're like for
I,
$1. Just kidding.
I've
well,
only
it
read
was
Probably
one.
like 10.
Yeah. I've only read one Tad Williams book, and it was a little novella called Caliban's Hour, and it's based on a character from The Tempest, Caliban. And it was good. I
Oh
liked
yeah.
it. It was very, I don't know, it was a very straightforward kind of tale, frame narrative, but at first I was not sure I was gonna like it, and then I really got engrossed. But I understand it's like one of the most obscure books he's ever read. Probably not something that is on the recommendation list for Tad Williams. So I will read other books by him in the future.
he's definitely an author that I want to read all of his stuff. I just haven't gotten to because I've been saying I'm going to read his Shadow March quadrilogy, which you can't see but is up here for so long, and I haven't got to it. I need to start Last King of Ostenard, which is the follow up. It's so Memory, Star, and Thorn. Tad Williams wrote. Then George R. Martin wrote A Song of Ice and Fire as a response to that. And then Tad Williams wrote Last King of Ostenard as a response to A Song of Ice and Fire,
Mm.
responding to him. So I'm really interested.
Yeah, cool. Well, I just got a notification that unfortunately, one of us has to go a little early today. So I'm
Sorry about
sorry
that.
about cutting it a little bit shorter than usual, but I'm really, really glad that we got this time
Yeah.
together. So
Oh, such a blast. You guys are amazing. This is
yeah,
so much fun. Seriously.
yeah.
Bryce, you just don't want to give us hot takes. I see how it is. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, what I didn't like Neuromancer. For some reason, all I can think of is science fiction now that you asked for fantasy books. Neuromancer did not do it for me.
I've
I've
not
heard
read
that's
What
a
that
else?
hard
book.
one to
I'll
get
give some
into,
more.
though.
Give some more.
Yeah.
More
It's
hot takes.
okay. It's okay. I'm just giving you a heck.
Yeah.
I got hot takes, okay? I actually liked Magician is one of my favorite by Lev Grossman, and like nobody likes
Oh,
it. So
I thought you
a
Oh,
meant
lot of people
the
don't like it.
Feist one.
I also
Haven't
like
read that
Magician
either.
Feist.
yeah. All right. Well,
All
thank
right.
you guys so much for joining me for this episode of Why You Read. It was so much fun to talk with both of you, and it's just so fun that we happened to be in the same stream together
Yeah.
2 nights ago. Meant for us to get back to Long Price Quartet because we did kind of talk about it a tiny bit in that stream, but maybe another time we'll get a chance. But I appreciate you guys so much. I really appreciate what you all do on your channels, and Yeah, and I appreciate all of you in the chat as well. So thank you all for being so kind, even though we gave some unpopular opinions in this particular why read discussion. It was really wonderful to hear your interaction, to hear your thoughts on these topics. And yes, so I guess that's it for now. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.